Good evening, welcome, and thank you for joining us for Race, Identity, and Ideology, the first in our new fall series, SNF Agora Conversations, Diversity, and Democracy. I'm Stephen Ruckman, Deputy Director of the SNF Agora Institute, an academic center and public forum at Johns Hopkins University that is dedicated to improving and expanding civic engagement and informed, inclusive dialogue as the cornerstone of global democracy. Diversity and Democracy is a series of discussions about how diversity and identity shape modern democracies. For today's deeply pluralistic democracies to work, citizens of all backgrounds, perspectives, and ideologies must be empowered to participate. Shared identity can bond groups and build power, but it can also deepen divides, impeding our ability to see the full diversity within cultures, within groups, and even within ourselves. Today's panel will look specifically at the limits we place on ourselves and on our fellow citizens when we sort segments of society into ideological blocks based on our understanding of their shared identity. Our panelists will discuss the ways in which oversimplified understandings of racial identity can lead to mistaken assumptions about people's beliefs, priorities, and political affiliations, and exacerbate already difficult racial divides. So just a couple of housekeeping notes before I introduce our wonderful guests. We will be starting with a panel discussion that will last for about 40 minutes, and then we'll be taking questions from the audience, but you should feel free to submit your questions at any time during the program using the Q&A function, and we'll make sure that questions get to our guests. Also, just to note that the chat function has been turned off, so we can use it to share any relevant information among the panelists tonight. So now I'm excited to introduce tonight's guests. Richard Alba is a distinguished professor of sociology at the Graduate Center at City University of New York and author of The Great Demographic Illusion: Majority, Minority, and the Expanding American Mainstream. His recent work argues against the widely believed majority-minority narrative, according to which whites will soon become a numerical minority, as a way of understanding the changes brought by increasing diversity and the future towards which the US is heading. Musa Algarbi is an SNF Agora visiting fellow and Paul F. Lazarsfeld Fellow in sociology at Columbia University. His research explores how knowledge is produced, transmitted, and put to use or not, and how thought is shaped by people's commitments and social contexts, and the extent to which narratives about social phenomena seem to correspond with apparent realities on the ground. His first book, We Have Never Been Woke: Social Justice, Discourse, Inequality, and the Rise of a New Elite, is under contract with Princeton University Press. And our moderator for this evening's discussion is Alex Samuels, politics reporter with 538 and author of the new Political Outliers column, which explores groups often portrayed as all voting the same way and dives into undercovered parts of the electorate, showing how diverse and atypical most voters are. So welcome, Richard, Musa, and Alex. Thank you all for being here tonight. And Alex, I will turn the conversation over to you.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you to everyone who is joining us today. We have a lot to get through, but first I want to give each of the panelists just a couple of minutes to talk about their recent work and research and how it relates to what we're going to be talking about over the course of the next hour. So, Richard, I will start with you first.
Thank you very much, Alex. So I've devoted a lot of my career to understanding how immigration changes societies, as well as, of course, the immigrants and their descendants. And recently, I've been concerned about, in the United States, about the issue of ethno-racial diversity growing as a result of immigration, and what implications that has for the American future, for the ethno-racial contours of American society. As Stephen noted, I have argued against the majority-minority narrative as a way of understanding that future. And I want to point out that's a very binary narrative. It envisions a society that's really divided into two parts along a major ethno-racial fault line between whites and people of color. And in particular, that narrative leaves out the growing number of mixed race and mixed ethnic Americans who are partly white and partly minority. The 2020 census really has called our attention to the growth of the mixed population. And what I find is that within all of the major ethno-racial categories, the mixed group is creating important internal diversity, internal heterogeneity. And I'll leave it there because I think there'll be a chance to talk about that as we go along.
Yes, we will definitely get to this idea of the minority majority and its implications, I promise. But yeah, Musa, I'll let you talk for a few minutes before we dive into the questions.
Sure. Okay, so I actually didn't focus too much on domestic political issues until 2015. And mostly what I study is knowledge, right? And so this is, and how my sort of entry point into this whole conversation was that around 2015, I noticed that there seemed to be this kind of epistemological bubble with respect to Trump. So it's not just that a lot of analysts didn't think, for instance, Trump was unlikely to win the nomination, but they thought it was impossible. There are all these columns that came out, like if Trump wins the Republican nomination, I'll eat the paper this column is printed on and things like that, right? But then, of course, he did win the nomination. And after he won, there was a little bit of hand wringing about, oh, well, we shouldn't underestimate him. We should learn some lessons from this. But then once Hillary Clinton secured the Democratic nomination, once again, we saw this proliferation of columns that ran basically like it's going to be a landslide of historic proportions. The Republicans are going to be destroyed for a generation, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I came from, and so as someone who studies knowledge, I was very interested in this and this phenomenon. One thing that I come from a sort of military family, and in the military intelligence communities, there's this practice called red teaming, where because people's lives are at stake, depending on how well their sort of model of the world is, a lot of times what they'll do is they'll have one team draw up a plan, and then they'll have some other people who had nothing to do with drawing up that plan basically approach it arguing, if you follow this plan, you're all going to die, and here's why. All right. And so basically, in the 2016 election cycle, I did, so the basics of red teaming is you assume the opposite of what you want to happen and then look for evidence for why that's likely to be the case. And so for 2016, I tried a red teaming exercise where I started looking for like, well, is there evidence actually that Trump could win? And I found, oh, wow, there's a lot, and people don't seem to be attending it too well. So I spent most of that cycle trying to convince people to take Trump's prospects more seriously, mostly in vain. Okay, and then after the election, I've been sort of increasingly frustrated with, it seems like that not a lot was learned from this sort of large epistemic failure that happened in 2016, in part because since the election, people have kind of seized on these narratives that are comforting for us, but not necessarily explanatory of the data. Basically Trump won because his voters are racist, sexist, stupid, authoritarian, fill in the blanks. And so what I've been spending a lot of the last year since is sort of analyzing the trends in the data and the extent to which those map on or don't with our preferred narratives for explaining what happened. And I'll say, just to close on that, I mean, one thing that we've seen is that the sort of popular narratives to explain what happened in 2016 actually do a pretty bad job at predicting what happened in 2018, what happened in 2020. It's actually very difficult to square some of the narratives that people popularly seize on with what actually seems to be happening with respect to people's voting preferences over time.
Great. Well, thank you both for saying, giving a few remarks there. Again, we do have a lot to get through, so I'm super excited. My first question for you both is kind of what you talked about just now, Musa. We often think of certain racial, ethnic, gender groups as voting a certain way, but what is the danger of lumping people into these relatively simplistic boxes?
Who would you like to start? Oh, Musa, please.
Oh, sure.
Whoever wants to start, definitely want you both to weigh in here, though.
Okay, let Richard go first.
Oh, okay. Well, I think there are two things. One is that, as I said in my remarks, there's a growing heterogeneity within these big categories, and that heterogeneity means it really, I think, makes it absurd to try to impose a single political idea on these very large populations. Maybe the easiest one to point to is the Hispanic population. So we were all very surprised to find in 2020 that despite all of the anti-Hispanic and anti-immigrant rhetoric of Trump, that it appears that more Hispanics voted for him in 2020 than voted for him in 2016. And I think that, that's a failure on our part to recognize that Hispanics are extremely diverse, for example, in terms of their national origin, whether they're Mexican or Cuban, or in some cases they're Argentinian or Chilean. These are groups that have really very different experiences and also fit very differently within the ethno-racial structures of American society. Not all of them are really people of color. But also, I think important is that Hispanics are very involved in the mixing that I referred to, and particularly there's a large part of the Hispanic population that is now partly non-Hispanic, and mainly that's non-Hispanic and white. These are often individuals who are embedded actually in largely white social contexts. So it's not surprising, that they're not voting then in the way that the stereotypical Hispanic, according to us, is voting.
Yeah. And so kind of following up on that idea, I mean, I think one of the big dangers that often happens is people kind of collapse what the sort of ideologies that are associated with the party with the demographic groups that are associated with the party. And what I mean by that is because like the Democratic Party is associated with kind of left aligned ideology, they assume that people who are affiliated with the Democratic Party must also be leftist. So if they notice that, for instance, about 8 to 9 out of 10 African Americans support the Democratic Party, or about 2/3 of Hispanics, support the Democratic Party in most elections, they go, oh, well, so, it must be the case that African Americans and Hispanics are liberal, right? That they must be kind of lefty. But in fact, they're not. African Americans and Hispanics on average tend to be more socially conservative or symbolically conservative in many respects than whites. And they tend to be more religious than whites. The way that, and so this kind of, the alignments that they have with the Democratic Party are not necessarily rooted in this, in some kind of ideological affiliation in many cases, so much as a sort of practical alliance, because say the Democrats are perceived as better allies on bread and butter issues or on civil rights or things like that. So that's one danger, is that we sort of misread what people's ideological leanings are. And there's this, in fact, there's a great study to follow up on a point that Richard made. There's this great study by Ian Haney-Lopez that looks at racial dog whistles. So these are remarks that are supposed to uniquely resonate with whites and like alienate people of color. They're ways of sort of talking about race in a colorblind way or something like this, basically is the idea behind racial dog whistles. And so a lot of scholars basically presume, they'll take statements that say a Republican, that say Trump makes, and presume that these are, code them as racial dog whistles, and then assume that they uniquely resonate with whites and that they resonate poorly with people of color. Okay, so what Haney-Lopez found when he took some of these canonical cases of racial dog whistles and presented them to different respondents is that across racial and ethnic groups, basically no one found these remarks to be racist, or very few found them to be racist. And in fact, they resonated more strongly. They resonated least strongly with whites, and they resonated most strongly with Hispanics, and more with African Americans than with whites. That is, these remarks that are coded as racial dog whistles resonated more with minorities than whites on average, according in Haney-Lopez's study. And this is actually not that hard to understand in some senses. So for instance, African Americans have long been one of the most skeptical populations within the Democratic Party with respect to immigration. Many Hispanics are also very concerned about immigration and border enforcement and don't necessarily take the position on that people on the left might assume. African Americans similarly are often, while generally supportive of police reform, are also supportive of police and concerned about crime and things like that, right? And so there's this kind of danger that can happen basically sometimes where we kind of where we say, oh, well, this party stands for this in our minds, and these people vote for that party, therefore they must agree with these things that we map onto the party. But actually, that's not the case. People support and align with parties for a whole bunch of different reasons. And they don't necessarily, and not necessarily because they share the ideological leanings of that party.
And so based on y'all's research, and I apologize if I'm, framing this question maybe in not the best way, but are people of color or mixed race people more similar to white Americans in their politics and how they see the world, or are they aligning more with other people of color?
Yeah, well, I think that's a very hard question to really answer. Again, because we're dealing with these very, very large categories that are immensely diverse within. So when we talk about people of color, we talk about African Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans. Again, all of these categories are themselves very large and diverse. I think that I don't think we can presume that merely because groups are fit into the category of people of color that they necessarily have the same ways of looking at the political world. I think that I think Asians, Hispanics are maybe very different from African Americans because their experiences have been very different. These are mainly immigrant groups, who've come since 1965 in large numbers in order to better their lives. They have not had the experience of oppression over centuries in the United States that many African American families have had. So I really don't think we can presume that they can act in a politically unified way. That's one of the big flaws, it seems to me, in the whole majority minority thesis. But in addition, I think that the mixed population, which I think is extremely interesting, on the whole, is much more advantaged than other people of color. They grow up, in a sense, with one foot in the white world. They have a white parent often. They have white kin. They have access to the cultural codes of whites and to some of the privileges of whites. And indeed, when you look at their adult lives, they often seem to be integrating into social worlds that are, if not wholly white, certainly mostly white. They have very high rates of marriage to whites, people of mixed background. So I think I think we really need to not use these big ethnic labels as ways of thinking about how the political divisions of our society can be mapped.
Just a like 2-second follow up. I basically agree with everything Richard said. I think maybe some more helpful ways to think about, in some cases, how people would what people's political affiliations might be. That might tell more in many cases than trying to decide, where a voter falls on the basis of their race, especially with respect to mixed race voters, would be to look at things like the communities they live in, the professions they hold, what their education level is, what their social networks are like. These kinds of things might be more predictive in many cases about what their sort of political leanings might be, how they might vote in a particular election than their racial or ethnic category might be. And then I guess one last note that with respect to African Americans, also there's this not much discussed but kind of important distinction, important in the sense of there's between people who are American descendants of slaves versus other Black populations in America. So for instance, when you look at, for instance, at colleges and universities and many other sort of professional managerial spaces which require college degrees. There's like a lot of the a lot of the Black people that you'll see at colleges and universities and in those settings are people who are mixed race. They're people who are Afro-Caribbean. They're people who are of African ancestry, as in like immigrants from Africa. And there are important socioeconomic differences and trends between people who are American descendants of slaves versus other Black populations in the United States. And just to touch on this point that Richard, just to sort of reinforce this point Richard made about how there's this kind of this sort of different history of generations of oppression and exclusion in America, that even within the Black population, there are important differences based on whether or not people hail from this population that's been sort of consistently oppressed over generations in America versus if they're if they're from some other Black ancestry.
And so building off that, and also Musa, you kind of talked about this in the beginning, what has been the most surprising misconception you guys have heard about either people of color or white voters?
I'm going to let Musa take the lead.
Okay, well, let's see. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about people of color. Maybe I'll spend a little bit of time on whites, and okay, so one thing that's interesting on whites. When you look at sort of poll after poll over the last 5 years, one thing that actually sticks out to me that's sort of counterintuitive is that the polls show that the GOP base has been growing warmer towards African Americans and Hispanics and immigrants and Muslims. They've grown more skeptical of Christian nationalism. They're more accepting of same-sex marriage and non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ Americans. And actually, and this is counterintuitive because there is a narrative out there, basically that runs that the GOP is basically an ethnic nationalist party, and that Trump especially is an ethnic nationalist candidate who won because of his basically appeal to white supremacy. But as I've shown elsewhere through a lot of my research, it actually seems that Trump's racialized rhetoric and policies might have been a consistent drag on his support with whites. What the Republican Party has seen consistent defections with white voters since 2014, and those defections might have ultimately led to Trump's demise. The GOP from 2016 on saw consistent gains in 2016, 2018, 2020 with African Americans, with Asians, with Hispanics, but those gains were more than offset by their losses with whites, and especially white men, and more particularly highly educated, relatively well-off whites. And that were the biggest defectors. And that makes sense in a way, because these are the voters we actually know from this specific block of voters, relatively well-off, highly educated whites, are the block of voters in America that are like most concerned, more than any other voters, about like decorum and civility and presidents being presidential and this kind of thing. So the idea that the kind of politician that Trump was and the kind of rhetoric that Trump spat would appeal to these voters, actually, it wouldn't. And we actually know from a whole bunch of research way before Trump was on the scene that kind of rhetoric probably wouldn't be appealing. And what we've actually seen in the data is that it's not. They've been consistently losing with whites, especially with those whites, but actually a pretty broad-based attrition with whites. And I guess the last thing I'll say is people, I mean, why this is interesting to me is because, so the GOP has been moving in this so GOP voters have been like kind of actually shifting left on a lot of these culture issues. And that's surprising because it seems like there's a growing gap between Democrats and Republicans on these very issues. And there is, but the reason why the gap is growing is not because it's not because they're going in different directions, they're going in the same direction. The difference is the Republicans are going in this direction like this, and the Democrats are going in that direction like this, right? So there's this kind of radical movement so they're going in the same direction, but the movement among Democrats has been much more radical, much more rapid in that direction. And so the gap between the parties has been growing for that reason, but not because Republicans have been shifting to the right. But a lot of scholars and analysts and have noticed the gap growing between Democrats and Republicans, and rather than wondering to what extent it might be because Democrats are behaving in sort of politically erratic ways, the sort of question that they lead with is what's going on with Republicans, right? And so if your starting question is what's going on with Republicans, then you're not really going to understand sort of why the gap is growing per se. You have to really look at both sides of it to see what's happening. Okay, so that's my sort of counterintuitive whites.
Okay, well those are good points. So let me come back to Hispanics as a surprise in the 2020 election. So it was surprising to me and to many people that the Hispanic vote for Trump was so large in 2020. And what I found interesting was that when journalists tried to understand this, they went to large Latino communities to try to find out how Latinos were thinking. They went, for example, to South Texas, or they went to Miami. And I think this is a really important misunderstanding. And Musa pointed correctly to things like social networks. The social networks in which people are embedded are going to tell you a lot about how they might vote. And so there's an assumption that being Latino means living in a community with Latinos. And that's really not true anymore. And so Latinos are really, many of them, especially the US born, those who've experienced some social mobility, are integrating into American communities that aren't exclusively Latino or even very heavily Latino. And I think this is a big dimension of difference within the Latino community that I'm certain is related to how people are voting, and probably helps a lot to explain why there was this surprising vote for Trump and why there may be surprising Latino support for Republicans.
I have a quick follow-up question to that, primarily for Musa, but Richard, if you want to weigh in, of course, I will not stop you. So if we're seeing more voters of color supporting the GOP, do Democrats need to change their messaging if they're trying to recruit voters of color? Do you think they've taken voters for color for granted? Just kind of like, what are your predictions there for what the party actually needs to do?
Yeah. So in this essay that I wrote a little while after the election for The Nation, I looked at sort of long-term trends with different sort of demographic groups from 2004 through 2020. And what I found is that, as again, there was this shift among whites towards Democrats starting after 2014. That seems to be driven by Trump, right? But the shifts that I talked about among voters of color away from the Democrats, those didn't start in 2016. Those go back to basically for some groups, they started right after 2008. For other groups, they started after 2010. But the point is, they've been going on for more than a decade. And so that the sort of trend of minority voters away from the Democratic Party is not driven by Trump, has nothing to do with Trump. It's about alienation from the Democratic Party. They're feeling, okay, so what's driving the alienation? I think maybe there are a few things. I think one of the biggest issues is that the priorities and messaging of the Democratic Party has shifted substantially since 2012. So again, a lot of voters are not aligned with the Democrats because they buy into sort of the kind of left ideology on culture that many highly educated voters especially support the Democrats because we agree with these kind of ideological, but that's not necessarily why a lot of other voters who vote Democrat are voting Democrat. They vote Democrat because they're seen as better allies for certain bread and butter issues. So to the extent that the party kind of shifts away from focusing on practical concerns that are sort of immediately relevant for the voters that and focus and lean more into these kind of culture war issues, that's probably going to alienate a lot of many voters of color. One, because it just doesn't speak to their concerns, and two, because they don't actually agree with the Democratic position on a lot of those issues. And then there's also this kind of, and even with respect to certain bread and butter issues, it's just the case that the sort of voters that Democrats are especially keen to kind of that they're especially keen to kind of represent or are especially sensitive to right now, again, highly educated, relatively affluent voters who live in cities, et cetera. Their view on a lot of bread and butter issues, again, is just out of touch with the view of many minorities. So again, with respect to African Americans and policing, a lot of African Americans in many communities in this country are both over policed and under policed. They live in communities where crime is on the rise, or even if it's not on the rise, where the situations were just not good, where people can be preyed on, they can have things stolen from them, they can be assaulted, and the police are not doing a great job of sort of addressing their safety concerns. And so when they hear, not necessarily the Democratic Party, because like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, for instance, are very careful about not saying, for instance, defund the police or anything remotely in that sphere. But when they hear sort of Democratic aligned people saying things like defund the police, and the Democratic Party officials, while not parroting those talking points, seem sympathetic to them or aren't sort of actively, right? That can be a point where you see this kind of distance growing, right? So I just think that the main issue is just that I think one of the main issues is just that the reason it's important for Democrats to understand why these voters are voting for them in the first place. If they're not voting for them because they agree with people on the left about a lot of these ideological issues, but are voting because they're concerned about bread and butter issues, and they think that Democrats are better allies. If Democrats aren't delivering on those things that they're aligned with the Democratic Party for, then they'll start looking at other places. Or to the extent that they, kind of prioritize the things they disagree with these voters, that these voters disagree with them on, i.e. this culture stuff, instead of sort of more practical matters, that can also alienate voters. So I think there's this kind of tension as the Democratic Party is increasingly focused on wooing kind of affluent, urban, highly educated voters, professionals, etc. This creates a kind of a deep tension within the party with respect to voters who are not that.
Let me just add to that, and I think that that Musa's made some very good points, but I think that the sort of the formula that now is used to describe the Democratic electorate of highly educated whites plus voters of color is really not a good way to think about a political strategy. And I think the Democrats need to be very worried going forward. 2020 was a relatively easy victory for Biden, at least in terms of the overall national vote, because Trump was the candidate, and many voters were turned off by Trump. But I found much more telling the congressional election. So Democrats lost seats in Congress, and it's not because of gerrymandering. If you look at the total vote at the national level for Democratic congressional candidates, it's very close to the percentage of Democrats in the Congress. So gerrymandering didn't skew the election in the way that many people think. And to me, that's very telling, because that's much clearer a reading of what people's kind of party affiliation is perceived by themselves to be than is whether they voted for Biden or Trump as the president.
And I do want to get to the census, but just building off of what you guys just said, I have one really quick question for you guys, which is there is some thinking that if the US becomes a minority majority nation, that would significantly help the Democratic Party. But can you each talk a bit about maybe why that's not the full picture?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, a lot of what we've said indicates why that's not the full picture. That I think let me start with this. That I think it's always dangerous when you take the current state of behavior and simply project it forward as if people are not going to change. And I think, you know, our society is still a very dynamic society. Many of the descendants of Asian and Hispanic immigrants are doing fairly well, as are many African Americans. Um, and so, and as Musa pointed out, it's, you know, politics is not simply a matter of your ethno-racial origin, but also all of the other statuses that you hold. And so I don't think that we should think about the future in that simplistic way. In addition, you know, there's not such a clear linkage between the demographic composition of the population and the demographic composition of voters. So in 2020, 72% of the voters roughly were white, at a moment when about 60% of the population is supposedly white. So, you know, even if this majority minority society comes about by mid-century, it's still going to be the case past mid-century that whites will be the dominant group in the electorate at the national level.
Yeah, I again, I find myself agreeing with pretty much everything Richard said. Okay, I think there's sort of four issues, four reasons why the sort of emerging demographic majority trends that why Democrats won't see the kind of returns on that many people had forecasted they would. So first, as we've talked about a couple times, it's premised on the idea that Democrats will retain their current vote share with different groups as those groups grow larger. That's implausible. As groups grow bigger, they tend to grow more heterogeneous. This is just a natural thing. So the idea that as these groups grow bigger, Democrats will maintain their current vote share with them, implausible. Okay, the second issue, and then especially again, as they don't just grow bigger, but as they are increasingly, as you see increasing sort of intermarriage with whites and social networks with whites, and you know, again, as they live in different places, take on different, you know, as they grow more heterogeneous in terms of their relationships and backgrounds and things like that, you'll see again more heterogeneity. So they won't retain their current vote shares. Second, there's alienation again for a lot of these voters. So even if trends did continue the way they're currently going, that wouldn't necessarily be great for Democrats because they're not trending in a good direction with these voting groups currently. So there's kind of ongoing alienation is another issue. Third, that a lot of these population changes are happening in districts that are already relatively safe, congressional districts for Democrats. You're seeing, so to the extent that areas that are already, that constituencies that Democrats are strong in are increasingly moving into areas that Democrats already firmly control, then that wouldn't change anything for them in terms of vote share on the Electoral College, in terms of congressional seats, things like that. So it would only even matter at all if you're seeing increasing diversity in places Democrats are weak. And that's happening too, but a lot of the concentration is in places Democrats are already strong in. So the big picture thing might not cash out to electoral changes the way they think. And then fourth, I guess, and this is another point that Richard just made, minorities, a lot of these minority populations tend to be irregular voters. So African Americans, for instance, don't vote, are less regular voters than white voters are on average. This is especially pronounced in like midterm elections, for instance. And irregular voters in general, people who are irregular voters, irrespective of their race, tend to be less likely to vote unless they're voting for a candidate they actually like. So that's to say, if a race is between the lesser of two evils, those voters tend to just stay home and not waste their time. Like, unless there's someone they actually like on the ballot, they tend not to go out and vote for that person if they're regular voters. And this is an issue because both parties are increasingly leaning into negative partisanship, right? This has been the increasing trend on both parties. It's like, why vote for Joe Biden? I'm not Trump. Why vote for, right? And so to the extent that Democrats continue to lean into this kind of negative partisanship story, they're actually going to suppress their turnout with a lot of these populations that tend to be more irregular voters. And I guess the last thing I'll note is that, like, when I talk to people about these trends, about how a lot of these groups have been trending towards the GOP, like the most common sort of rejoinder is, okay, yeah, but Republicans, they don't have anywhere near a majority of, say, African Americans. Okay, Democrats have lost a little bit on the margin, but like there's no chance that a Republican is ever going to win a majority of African Americans anytime in the foreseeable future. And the response to that is no. I mean, sure, they probably won't. But the thing about it is Republicans don't need a majority or anywhere near a majority with a lot of these groups to deny Democrats victory. If they get margin shifts of 1 to 2 percentage points of African Americans, 3 to 5 percentage points of Latino, things like these kind of small shifts can be all that it takes to basically kill Democrats' prospects in national elections, as happened in 2016, or to kill them even in more local races, right? So they don't actually need anywhere near a majority. These little shifts matter. They matter a lot, and Democrats really need to be attentive to them in a way that they haven't been. Okay, that's all I'll say.
I do want to give people a couple minutes to submit their questions, and while that's happening, I do want to ask you guys each one last question, and that is that the census results were released semi-recently, and I'm curious to hear from each of you, what was the most surprising takeaway from the census?
Well, I think the big takeaway, I won't call it surprising to me, but the big takeaway is the growing importance of the mixed population. And I think that, the census in 2020 changed its rules of racial classification to be able to better measure the mixed population. And I do think they did a better job. Now, that had an implication also for the white population because, 90% of mixed race people in the United States are partly white, according to the most recent census data. So the Census Bureau reclassified, and it's very clear in the way they describe their attempts to improve the measurement of mixed race. They reclassified some people who said they were just white on the census into a mixed race group. And so an implication of this is that these big headlines about the fall in the white population are not right. Mm-hmm. The white population didn't actually fall in absolute numbers, although it is a smaller proportion of the population in 2020 than it was in 2010. But this kind of accelerating decline of whites, which a lot of people think was the big and surprising finding from 2020, isn't correct.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add to that. I mean, I think that's the big story is the multi, and I'll say, I mean, Dr. Alba's book came out, of course, it's like her perfect, like he wrote this book and it came out like just as the census results were coming out, and it speaks. And it's so important to sort of speak to this moment, to contextualize the kind of the findings that the census had. I think the big story that people should keep their eye on in the census and beyond is relates to these mixed race, mixed ethnicity voters, but to underline a point that Dr. Albers made a couple of times. I think one thing that's important to kind of bear in mind is that what seems like a big change in terms of the stats is probably going to be less of a big change than people think, in part because actually not as much has changed as people think. It's like this kind of this change in classification, this change in how they compute these numbers doesn't correlate with the change in population the way. And then similarly, I mean, one thing that I'll add is one thing that's maybe a little, one thing that's changed politically over since the time of the last census is for a lot of people who were mixed race or mixed ethnicity who would have previously identified as white, for some of those voters, they might not feel as comfortable identifying as white or just only white today, just because like whiteness, it's like whites and whiteness itself is kind of depending on your circles, especially if you're like highly educated or if you're a professional or whatever, like whiteness itself is kind of widely denigrated within those professional circles or within academia or within whatever. So if you're someone who's in college or who's college educated or who works in a professional field, you might be less inclined to identify yourself as white than you would have been 10 years ago. But of course, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything in terms of like changing population or in terms of changing how you're going to vote or anything like that. So, okay, I'll just leave it there.
I do want to ask, get to our audience questions. So our first one is to Musa. Do you think that the concentration of left-leaning ideology within many universities contributes to the research biases and mistakes that you highlight?
Oh, I mean, sure, it can. I mean, I think, of course, because again, like and here's why. Here's one way that it commonly plays out, is that people often, people think that their own beliefs are true. That's why we hold our beliefs. It's because we think they're correct, that they're factually correct, that they're morally correct, etc. Okay, but one consequence of this kind of normal human inclination to think that is that when we see people who believe things that are very different from us, our natural inclination is to start by asking, well, what's wrong with those people? Right? So if our beliefs are well-founded and are correct and are moral, and they believe something that is radically inconsistent with our well-founded, moral, et cetera, well-researched beliefs, then it must be because they're ignorant or perhaps sort of otherwise have some kind of problem, moral problem, intellectual problem, etc. So differences are often explained in terms of pathology or deficit. And you see this, for instance, in a lot of political science research, where there's all sorts of studies that are asking the question, like, why would someone vote for, say, Trump? And there aren't a lot of studies that go, why would someone vote for Hillary Clinton? It's not even considered an interesting question. It's like, we take it as obvious why someone would vote for Hillary Clinton. Obviously, she's the better candidate. So like the whole framing the study this way of like, why would someone vote for Trump, is the whole framing of the study presents it as some kind of aberration, as some kind of weirdness that needs to be explained, right? And it's usually explained in terms of pathology or deficit. Again, last thing I'll say is that like there's this whole genre of studies where that are literally like the setup of the study is what best explains why someone would vote for Trump. Is it because they're more racist or sexist or authoritarian, right? All bad options. And obviously, if there was a study that was done that was like, why would someone vote for Hillary Clinton? Is it because they hate America or they're communist or right or something like that? We would go flag on the play. That's a prejudicial study design. This is a garbage study. But there's a whole genre of these that are, designed symmetrically to understand Republicans and that are asymmetrically to understand Republicans. And we don't necessarily see a problem with that. It's kind of normal. And so this is a case where when we think about the world in a certain way and we understand this kind of, and we're trying to understand sort of divergence from us, and when everyone, that in itself is a problem. But then when everyone else in our community, in our field, in our basically shares the same kind of starting point, the same analytical starting point, then you can, rather than kind of correcting biases and sort of shortcomings and oversights and things like that, like peer review is supposed to do, this kind of adversarial process, what you can happen instead is you can get kind of a magnification or an intensification of the sort of bias. So it's a problem, but that's not the only reason why you see this.
And this is a question that I'm kind of tweaking a bit from the respondent. But basically, I think that just the question is, do you think the huge increase in information about our lives, which enables data firms like Facebook and Netflix to finally slice our affinities, has changed how we think about identity at all?
Wow. Well, that's that's a hard question to answer. At least I find it so. But yeah, it has to, because I think we're all saturated with information, far more than we had, let's say, 10 or even 10 or 20 years ago. And I do think that it changes the way we think, and we're constantly kind of sort of realigning ourselves and measuring ourselves really against the information flow that's coming toward us.
Yeah, and I mean, I think one other way in which I mean, I think that the sort of analytical aspect of it, the amount of data that's collected and shared, and the ways that different political campaigns try to analyze and utilize this data, definitely seems to be changing how politicians, try to appeal to and reach voters, often in ways that are not helpful. I mean, like there have been a couple of campaigns where people have tried, where they've been kind of led astray. But actually, what I think is sort of more interesting about the changes with respect to things like social media as it relates to identity is there's this kind of the way that it changes how we sort of perform our identities, because before it was the case where you went to work, you were a certain person at work, you went home, you went out with your friends, you were a certain, you could kind of shift identities as you shifted your social context. In fact, a lot of sociologists used to talk about how, for instance, in cities, one of the most interesting things about cities was that as you shifted between all of these different contexts, you had the opportunity and the flexibility to be all these kinds of different people in different contexts, depending on. Less so, because your sort of presentation follows you everywhere. If you move to a new city, guess what? There's this whole digital paper trail of everything that you've ever said since you were a teenager. If you when you're at work, when you're in private. So, like for instance, there's this woman who was just fired because she got in an argument in a park with someone and made kind of a racially awkward. She told someone to go back to their hood or something, and it's weird. It's a weird phrasing on her part. But the point is, the idea that her saying that would have any implication at all on her being fired from her job when she was not in any way acting in a capacity at work or whatever, is in part because her employer was in a position where they were getting a bunch of flack because people looked on the internet and said, oh, well, this person works for you. What do you think about these comments that she made, right? And so this kind of, this ability that we had before to kind of separate our work lives from our home lives, or our church lives from our social lives, or, to be one way in the town we come in and a different way in the city, or to move and start fresh and create, all of that is being kind of radically interrupted as a result of these social profiles, these media profiles. And so it changes the way that we relate to our identities. And I think it creates actually sort of more rigid in some senses, or more consistent. There's less flexibility. There's less ability to kind of change and experiment and to evolve and whatever than there was in the past in some important respects.
I think that what you just said is really important, and I think an implication of it is that the social media are really contributing to the polarization that we see in the larger society by sort of creating these communities that sort of draw from a common pool of quote facts, which are not always necessarily facts, and which make sharp distinctions between their epistemological world and the epistemological world of others.
And we have time for one more question, but I do want to be respectful of people's hours. So if you guys can try to just keep that in mind as you're answering this next question. So this next question says, my perception has been that it is precisely those who complain the most about the binarization or racialization who are the most guilty of reducing the diversity of Americans to two categories. And those two categories are usually whites versus Black and Indigenous people of color. So one, do you agree with this? If yes, how would you explain it? And if no, then how would you explain that somebody like the questioner who asked this might get that impression?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a tension, and it's kind of a long-running tension, in that, like, how do you organize to address, say, problems that are faced by African Americans without sort of reinforcing or reifying the very racial categories that you're trying to transcend, right? That's a deep problem. It's a long-standing problem, and it's not an and I think there is a sense in which so there is a sense in which oftentimes you will hear people on the left saying things like race isn't real, we need to, et cetera, but at the same time are very like focused on race, on the very thing that they insist that they're trying to abolish, right? And so there is a deep tension there, and I think it's also the case that, as is often the case, that people often talk about things in kind of sloppy, ham-fisted, reductionist, fundamentalist ways, especially on the internet, but even in contexts where you would think they have more flexibility to show subtlety. So there is a tendency to kind of divide the world into people of color, or BIPOC is the current fashionable trend, and whites. I think Richard's book is a great place to start for why that's not a helpful way of trying to understand what's happening in a lot of contexts. But there is that tendency, especially on the internet, again, where on Twitter, you're restricted to 280 characters. So things happen like that. But I think the big tension, the deep tension, is just lies in this question of how can it be possible for people to sort of organize to address sort of problems like racial injustice or common problems that people of different ethnic groups face without reinforcing or reifying the very sort of racial concepts that the very racial distinctions that they're trying to sort of overcome. That's actually kind of a deep problem. It's a non-trivial problem.
I think that was such a profound observation that I'm not going to say anything further on this.
Well, thank you both, and thank you to all our audience members who submitted questions. I think Stephen's going to come back now and give a few closing remarks.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Musa and Richard. That was such a fascinating conversation, and you packed an enormous amount of insight into this hour and helped all of us to see the importance of breaking out of reductionist thinking about these issues of race, identity, and ideology. And thank you to our audience for tuning in and asking great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them tonight. But I wanted to make sure we all knew that our Diversity and Democracy series continues next week with a conversation between SNF Agora director Hari Han and Vishaka Desai, author of World as Family, A Journey of Multi-Rooted Belongings. That event will be taking place in person on the Homewood campus, and it will be live streamed and recorded as well. So visit the link in the chat for more information about that. And you can find more information about all of our upcoming events at snfagora.jhu.edu or click on the link posted in the chat. You can also sign up for our bi-monthly e-newsletter by clicking the link. And finally, a recording of tonight's conversation will be available on our website in the coming days and on our YouTube channel. So check it out. Thank you again and enjoy your evening.
Ooh.